So today's paper, I wanted to talk predominantly about standardisation and subjunctives and how the two sort of interact with each other. But actually my starting point is a series of questions that I've been thinking about quite a lot over the last sort of year or so. And it's the sort of questions that sort of have a lot of different facets and sort of appear and sort of come to the fore in different ways. Okay. So my starting point is thinking about what we mean by Old English language, and really this question right at the bottom, whether we can get to real Old English. When we think about Old English, our traditional accounts focus on the kind of authorial texts or the supposed authorial texts of, for example, our prose works. So we're often really interested in early manuscripts. We're interested in dialectally distinct manuscripts, the ones that are earliest and can get us closest to what we think are the authorial or the translator's intentions when they first made these translations from Latin. The thing with this in where I find it problematic is that actually a lot of our versions of these manuscripts come from the 11th century, and they're copies of maybe copies. So what we've got is something that's really quite lays quite a long way away from these original supposed authorial texts. And often they get overlooked because of this. We don't always prize these manuscripts because they're not original. And what I want to argue today is that we're sort of missing a trick with this, because a lot of these manuscripts, they can tell us very important stuff in the way that their scribes update the language, what they choose to transmit, what they don't transmit. And I'm interested in looking at scribes in sort of looking at the kind of linguistic profile that they have. And when you look at these profiles as sort of a collection of features that they transmit or don't transmit, this actually tells us some quite interesting stuff. So often with these authorial texts, as I mentioned, the original text may or may not exist. For the case of today's talk, I'm talking about the Old English Bede. We don't have the original translation. Okay. And the place of these divergent manuscripts and late or confused readings, actually, I think these are quite valuable. As I'll come on to talk about, things like corrections, glosses, annotations, these tell us some really interesting stuff. If somebody goes to the effort and the bother of making a correction that we can, in many cases, see, sometimes we can't see them, then obviously this was an important enough feature that for some reason it has some kind of resonance, it's salient in one way or another. So the case study I'm going to talk about, it doesn't really dispute the broader story of what happens to Old English subjunctives, the fact that they're there in Old English, they die out by the time we get to Middle English. But it does give us more detail about how individual writers reacted, and I think looking at one particular feature is quite a nice way of being able to do this. So more broadly, the kind of research questions I've been looking at is really about putting the scribes back into the story of English. And I'm interested in this kind of marginal secondary material, things like exactly like these corrections, because I think they do give us a more detailed understanding of the history of English. They bring a social dimension, which sometimes is lacking in the studies that we have. And I think, from my point of view, what I find interesting is they give us direct and indirect evidence for attitudes to language. So for today's study, I've got the Old English Bede. It survives in about 6 Anglo-Saxon manuscripts or manuscript fragments. As I said, the original translation no longer exists. And within these 6 manuscripts, we have about 15 scribal hands present. They range in date from the late 9th or early 10th century up until the second half of the 11th century. And in dialect, they're moving from Mercian in the earliest ones to late West Saxon in the later manuscripts. This particular study looks at 4 manuscripts and 7 scribes. So my 4 manuscripts, the sigla are here. So we have T manuscript, this is the earliest one. O manuscript is the second earliest, and that's from the early 11th century. Sorry, T is from the sort of late 10th. B is from the second half of the 11th century, and CA is also second half of the 11th century. From the map here, you can see that our earliest manuscripts like T, these have a lot of features that come from, have a Mercian dialectal basis to them. As we move through time, the later manuscripts have far more West Saxon. And this is in line with other manuscripts of other work from this period. So I wanted to start off with thinking about subjunctives and the kind of things that our textbook tells us about subjunctives. So Mitchell and Robinson, the book that I learnt Old English from, tells us that for subjunctives, one of the following ideas may be present. It could be condition, desire, obligation, supposition, perplexity, doubt, uncertainty, unreality. Okay. There are problems, though, with 11th century evidence, because this is sort of a crucial period in the history of English, because post-conquest evidence often looks rather different from the pre-conquest texts that we have. But the 11th century material is sort of it's a bit of a gap, because, as I said, a lot of these texts are copies. They're preserving, in some ways, quite fossilised linguistic forms. So it looks like we get this sudden jump after the conquest and things look very different, but actually the 11th century material, I think, is very often masking what's going on sort of underneath. And so what I want to show you today is a way of kind of trying to unravel what might be going on. Okay. So if we look at Old English, preterite subjunctive, so these are the particular features I'm looking at today. This is the kind of thing that we're looking at. If we look at the indicative, this is a weak verb. You can see that the plurals, which is what I'm really focusing on, they only really differ by one vowel in the second syllable, third syllable even. So if you want to say we loved, you say we lovedan, but if it's subjunctive, it's we lovoden. Okay, so my example down here, he lovedan cheese, they loved cheese, versus he said on that he lovoden cheese. They said that they love cheese, but they might not have done. Okay. And the particular feature that is at the heart of the variation I'm looking at today is this N on the end. So what we get is denasalisation. So this happens in a variety of different kinds of words, not just in verbs. I've got some examples here. So you might see, instead of beyondan, beyond, you might see that it's written beyonder. Servo instead of servon. He quomun, they came, for you might see written as he quomun. Okay. Campbell tells us that actually denasalisation is quite frequent. He says that you get it definitely in early Northumbrian, and this loss of fine line is quite frequent. He says it's established in quite a lot of different areas, so we have weak inflection of nouns and adjectives, adverbs in an, in numerals, infinitives, and in subjunctive plurals, present and past. So this is what I'm interested in. So an example of this we have from T manuscript, our earliest manuscript. So, and he said that they were wretched and miserable, that they would not obey their God in whom they believed. Okay. So we have an example here that is reported speech, and we can see here that we've got a plural pronoun. And what we've got here, it looks a bit weird because it looks like it's a singular verb form. So it looks like were. We'd expect to see weren. Okay. What we've actually got is a denasalised subjunctive here. Another example, so it says, and when afterwards asked why they did so, they could give no other answer except that they were angry. Okay, so again, it's reported speech, and we have a similar thing here with heo, a plural pronoun, and this is linked with what looks like a singular, but actually it's a denasalised plural. Both of these examples come from T manuscript, and as we'll see as we go along, actually this manuscript is the one that has most of these forms, which is not surprising. I mean, what we do find is that there are places in the text where all four manuscripts that I'm looking at today they all agree in having a denasalized reading. So from this, we can suppose that denasalized forms are something that do go back to the exemplar, to the archetype. Okay, it looks like they are something that comes from that very early Mercian translation. My next example is from O manuscript. So this is the next oldest, and this is quite an interesting manuscript because the scribe, he's not very good, and that's not just my assessment. He's not very good by the judgment of his peers. He writes, he's a Missprache scribe, so when he copies several, quite often he copies faithfully according to his exemplar, but he also mixes this really quite freely with his own scribal norms. So you get a text that's not very consistent dialectally, and he has a really wide variation in the kind of forms that he presents to us. And he gets quite often corrected. So you can see here, he exhorted and encouraged them that they should continue steadfast in their faith. So again, we have he, plural pronoun here, and awunade. So this is our nice little denasalized subjunctive. And what you can see in the example from the manuscript, you can see this little n that's been added in superscript. Okay. This isn't the only kind of inked correction that you get in this manuscript. They correct all sorts of things. It's quite interesting actually because they're not consistent in what they do, these corrections. So some of them correct according to the exemplar form, and some of them, like this one, correct away from the exemplar form, presumably to their own sort of norms that they have. The other thing to mention is that a little bit of a problem with these corrections is that it's very difficult to tell who wrote them. I don't think they're all written by the main scribe. I think somebody else has written them. But this also means that I don't know whether it's just one scribe who is responsible for all of the inked corrections or whether more than one is responsible. This is quite a nice example as well. So whereas before we've got a little superscript n, you can see in these examples we've got the n sort of squashed right in at the end here. Okay. So for this example, they rather with belief in eternal life and the resurrection to glory desired to die therein than to live in foulness of unbelief among their idols. Okay. So we can see that for this particular manuscript, you get sort of all sorts of different kinds of correction, but what we can definitely say is the people who are making these corrections don't really seem to like these denasalized versions of the verbs. These ink corrections are not the only kind that we get in the manuscript. So we also get a lot that are made with Drypoint. And what you probably can't see, just above here, we have a little sort of Drypoint 2Ts, and here we've got a Drypoint M. I've only chosen these because they're about the best, about the best pictures I've got. So that's my very clumsy drawing in of them. So that's what it looks like. They're quite difficult to see these, so they're written in with a stylus rather than with pen and ink. So it's rather like if you've got a biro that's run out of ink and you sort of press onto a pad of paper. It's that kind of effect, and equally difficult to read. But what's really interesting about the way that this particular corrector works, he is a proper grammatical pedant. I was really excited when I found these. It turns out I just have somebody who really wants to stamp his own grammatical mark on this text. And one of the things that he really does not like are these denasalized subjunctives. So I've got an example here. So the one at the top is O's reading. So we have, and they said that they preferred and desired to be the saving of the people as they were entreated. So this is, again, one of these with reported speech. So we've got our nice little pronoun here in plural form with our little denasalized subjunctive. And this is quite interesting because what we've got here is a superscript in Drypoint ON. If you compare it with the other manuscripts, we can see that in the same place, T has a denasalized reading, but what you've got from your later manuscripts, actually they do the same thing that this annotator is doing. They also have a reading that has what looks like an indicative there. This one is quite an interesting one as well, and I quite like this, thank you, because you can see that all sorts of things are going on. The ink corrector has squashed in an N here and put a superscript DE, so you've got on sender, and this is what we've got in all the other manuscripts, but actually what you can't see here is you've got a superscript ON as well. So it looks like not only does our Drypoint annotator not like it when you have these sort of what he thinks is a mistake because it has a denasalized form, sort of as it is in the text, even when it's been corrected, he's still not really satisfied. So he's got a really sort of strong idea that this is quite an inferior text, I think. And the final example that I wanted to show you was actually this one. So we have an example with the word Whiston. This looks initially like it's a different kind of denasalization, so this looks like it's an indicative form. But when you look at what's in the manuscript, I don't know how easy it is to see this, can you see that this looks like it's got an erasure underneath the O? And also if you look at the angle here, you've got a bit of a corner. So when this scribe writes an O normally, he's got quite a sort of a curve in that corner. So it looks like this has been amended from an E to an O and then had the N added. So this is what I was saying earlier about how these particular correctors, the ink ones, they're not necessarily very consistent in what they do. So whereas some of the other versions, they're quite happy just to add an N to make it look like an ordinary subjunctive, this one just makes it look like it's an indicative. So when we look across the sort of corpus as a whole, so these are figures from book 3 of the Bede, there's 5 books altogether. You can see that denasalized subjunctives occur most often in T manuscript, which is our oldest, and that's not surprising, really. O, so this is our Missprache scribe, he has 11 of these forms, and then the 2 manuscripts that are really sort of quite late in the 11th century, they have far fewer of these forms. Although it is interesting that they have some. So it looks like these relict forms do kind of slip through quite often. In contrast, when we look across at all the places where denasalized subjunctives appear in one or another manuscript, you can see that actually we've got quite a lot of indicatives. Even T has some indicatives instead of denasalized subjunctives. So it looks like all of our scribes are sort of doing the same thing to a greater or lesser extent. And you can see that again, this particular set of manuscripts here, they've got quite a lot of these indicatives. The numbers don't add up all to 18 because you've got different, some manuscripts don't have certain parts of the text. So that's why the numbers don't look quite as tidy as they could. Okay. And then finally, if we look at what O is doing, we can see that this is a really messy manuscript. We've got nasalized subjunctives where the N has been added by the corrector, so we've got 4 of those. We've got a nasalized indicative that's been converted from what was a denasalized subjunctive, so that's the Wistow example. And then for dry points, we've got 6 of those that I've managed to find where the ON has been added. Okay. So I said that this wasn't going to kind of rewrite our history of what happens. But it's quite nice because it shows that what we can see in this set of manuscripts is something that has been seen elsewhere. So there are studies by people like Bloomfield and Needham who've also sort of found this particular pattern. So Hogg tells us that in the 9th and 10th centuries, the inflection of the preterite plural subjunctive changed to on. And he says this isn't the complication it might appear to be, for what we are certainly witnessing is the falling together of the indicative and subjunctive inflections under the indicative. So that is to say we're witnessing the beginnings of the demise of separate inflections for the subjunctive. And this is not surprising because what we're seeing at this time, and not just in the subjunctive, is inflections that are unstressed, they're losing their specific vowel quality. So we see this, for example, in dative plurals as well. So what we're seeing, I think, are scribes who are responding particularly to the fact that there's no singular plural marking, rather than the fact that it's not subjunctive. So in conclusion, the Old English Bede is sort of letting us see these kind of patterns in more detail. We've got this move from the N forms to the on forms, and they're identical with the indicative. And these corrections frequently show this addition of the N. I like these dry-point additions because they show something really quite interesting as well. They show that this particular writer doesn't recognise this denasalised form as a subjunctive plural. It also shows that for a lot of these writers, what's really important and salient is this number marking, and that they're not recognising forms or not feeling the need to write a form that distinguishes between a subjunctive and an indicative. Okay. I think this might tell us something about scribal repertoires, what they're used to writing. And finally, I think this tells us something really interesting about notions of acceptability and correctness. So this annotator who writes in Drypoint, he's really definite about what he does and doesn't like. He goes to a lot of effort to put this into the manuscript, but subjunctive marking is not one of the things that he's got to be in his bonnet about. Thank you.